My name is David Frame. I'm Dean of the University of Management and Technology. I welcome you to our presentation today, which is going to cover project management. We call this Project Management Overview. What we'll be doing in this presentation is looking at some of the basic issues of project management. We'll be looking at what is project management, what are the stages that it takes to carry out the project. We'll be looking at tools, techniques. We'll be examining things like the impact of people on projects and the impact of projects on people. So once again, welcome to the program, and what we will do is to begin by talking about the basics. Let's start off by asking a very basic question, and that is, what is a project? A project is something that occurs in a finite block of time. Okay, so it has a defined beginning and an end. It produces a deliverable. Okay, so there's some product or service that the project is going to be producing. The project itself is unique. Every project is a bit different from every other project. And then one other feature I'd like to mention here is that the project tends to be inherently complex. Even a simple project is comprised of many different pieces that fit together in a systems-like way. So we have inherent complexity there. So I'd like to take a look at each of these items with a little more depth to see the implications of the items. Okay, one thing is that's well known about projects is that they're supposed to occur in a finite block of time. They're supposed to have a defined beginning and a defined end. And this has tremendous implications, because what it tells us is that we have to operate with deadlines. So we have a time constraint in doing a project. Now, in the old days, when Pharaoh was building pyramids 4,500 years ago, certainly there was a deadline date. People are going to die. Pharaoh will die, and he wants to have his tomb ready to be able to deal with his demise. But even then, you begin the pyramid early enough, and how long does it take to build a pyramid? Well, it's done when it's finally done. So historically, when we did projects, we weren't really doing project management. We were just building something, and the deadline date, while important, didn't assume the kind of critical importance that it does today. So projects then are supposed to have defined beginnings and ends, and this puts a lot of pressure on us to make sure that we meet our various promised dates. Second feature about projects is that they produce deliverables. Let me rephrase that a little bit. Let me broaden it. Projects produce results. So you'll have a team of people working to achieve some kinds of results. People who gravitate to project management tend to be results-oriented people. I myself, I'm very much a results-oriented person. As a professor, I like to prepare lessons. I like to write books and articles. I like to do research, to crank out things. Not everybody is results-oriented in this sense. Let me just share a personal story to get this across to you. Back towards the end of the 1980s, I was chairman of a large-sized department. We had some 30 professors, and my job for 2 years that I was chair was to make the department function effectively, to motivate my professors, to do all sorts of curriculum development issues, attend committee meetings, these kinds of things. During those 2 years, I was very unhappy, because during those 2 years I was unable to actually produce physical results. I wasn't able to produce new courses, I wasn't able to write books, do articles, do research, these kinds of things, but I was very busy. And what was I doing? I was managing a process. Many people in their work lives manage processes. They're And the kind of process I'm talking about right now is a white-collar process where you're running an office. So you hold staff meetings, you come to the office in the day, you sit at your desk, people come to you with issues that need to be handled, you're working out budget requests, meeting with the president of a university in my case, and with other department chairs, these kinds of things. And fundamentally it was very much more a reactive type of existence than someone who's out there consciously trying to generate results. So with projects, we're trying to generate results. The deliverable may be something very substantial, like a bridge, or an office building, or a fighter aircraft. Today, increasingly, our deliverables are less and less tangible. More people are doing projects in information technology than all the other kinds of projects that deal with physical products put together, probably multiplied by a factor of 10 or 15. So we produce a deliverable. Increasingly, these deliverables are intangible. We're producing software, we're producing knowledge, these kinds of things. So to reiterate, with a project, we're producing a deliverable, and we have a time constraint in which we're going to produce the deliverable. A third feature of projects is that they are unique. They are one-of-a-kind undertakings. Now, some projects are more unique than others. For example, if you're building the 30th house in a 100-unit housing development, the building of that 30th house isn't very unique. You've already built 29 other houses, and let's say these are being built to the same blueprints, and we're using the same materials. Okay, so in building that 30th house, you don't face enormous amounts of uniqueness, but nonetheless, even though these houses are being built in what we call cookie-cutter fashion, one house is built the same as all the other houses, there are issues of uniqueness that we have to contend with. For example, each house will be built on a different piece of land. If your house is located at the bottom of a hill, then the builder has to be sensitive that when it rains, the water can come down and get into the basement of your house. So the builder has to contour the land so the water goes around the house. On the other hand, if you're built on the top of the hill, you'll have other issues to contend with. You may be concerned about the stability of the foundation. Other issues of uniqueness will be the work crew. That's probably the greatest degree of uniqueness. Each house will be built by a different work crew, and these teams of workers have different degrees of skill, they have different skills levels, they have different motivation levels, and so forth, so that they'll have a different attitude towards the building of each of these houses and different capabilities allowing them to build each house. So as you're building the houses, you may have changes in regulations. It may be that the previous type of piping that you're using in the house is now considered dangerous, and they make you replace that type of piping with a new type of piping. So these things happen all the time when we carry out projects. So even a simple project that's not so simple, but even a routine project like building house number 30, you're going to find has some measure of uniqueness that distinguishes that house from other houses in the community. Now, there are projects that have very high degrees of uniqueness. This is characteristic of projects in the science areas. Basic research is research we carry out in the sciences where we don't have any idea what the basic research will lead up to. Now here, it's very unique. If a scientist goes into the laboratory, very often he or she won't even know what to do that day until that individual examines the results of last night's experiment. Maybe there's some bacterium in a petri dish. You examine the results of yesterday's experiment, and that tells you what you need to do today. So we have tremendous variations then in the degree of uniqueness in our projects. Some are quite routine, building house number 30 in a housing development. Others are very unique, trying to, say, find a cure for cancer. So this is something that we have to recognize. Now, even the fairly routine projects, because they have a degree of uniqueness, then encounter some measure of risk. That's the implication of uniqueness. All projects, because they are unique, encounter some measure of risk. They have to be able to deal with surprises. Now, the fact that our project is unique and has to contend with risk presents us with major implications in planning our project. Think about it. If your project is based on guesswork to a large extent, okay, then the plan you have is a guess. All plans are guesses. Even the most carefully devised plan ever undertaken in the history of the world is a guess, because the future is unknown. There is some measure of uniqueness in this undertaking, distinguishing it from other undertakings that you have pursued. So when you think about that, then that feature of projects, the fact that every project is unique, has tremendous management implications, issues that we should be sensitive to. For example, let me just give another example here. If the project is unique and it's based on guesswork, then you know that your plan is going to change. Changing plans is inevitable on projects. You can count on it. It's going to happen. So are you prepared to deal with the change? That's the real issue. We're talking here about management, managing things. The big concern in management is not can we avoid horrible things happening. The big issue in management is if bad things happen, can we deal with them? Do we know how to cope with them? And if change is inevitable, do we have processes in place to manage the inevitable change? So as we go through this program, you'll see that we'll be talking about a lot about dealing with surprises and struggling with imperfect information. The fourth area of that we're focusing on in defining projects, the fourth item, is that projects have inherent complexity. Now, I'm not saying that all projects are very difficult to carry out. When you clean your garage on a Saturday, that's hardly a tremendously complex undertaking. However, if you were to document every step that you took, if you were to document what needed to be done in a high level of detail on your garage cleaning project, you would see that you can start creating some pretty complex systems diagrams showing how the pieces fit together. My point here is not that we should make simple projects more complex than they need to be. My point is that even simple projects, when you examine them, when you analyze them carefully, you will see have many components. These components are interrelated because projects are systems. Now, the management implication of projects being systems is pretty obvious. For example, with systems in general, if one piece of a system breaks, this is going to have ripple effects on other pieces of the system. If I have a delay on task A, this could very well cause a delay on tasks B, C, and D as well. Another implication of a project being a system is that you need to manage the detail of the individual items, let's say the individual tasks and components of the system, but you also need to manage the whole system. So you have to concurrently focus on the details and also at the same time manage the larger effort. You should never lose sight of the larger effort even as you're focusing on the details. This isn't easy to do. Being a project manager is very challenging because you've got to be able to deal with detail, big issues, you have timelines, you have surprises, you have risks. All of these things taken together create an environment that's very challenging for project managers. So that's some of the basic insights we have on what is a project. Now let's take a quick look at what is project management. What is project management? Well, an obvious, dry, boring academic definition would be project management is the process of bringing your project to fruition in as effective a manner as possible. Okay, that definition possibly sounds impressive. The problem is it's not really telling us very much. A few years ago, I did a survey of 135 project managers, and I asked them, I said, tell me in your own words, using your own words, what is project management to you? And 80% of them responded with astonishing consistency. 80% of these 135 people said basically that to them project management was about getting the job done. Okay, they said, my job is to get the job done. Now, that answer shouldn't be surprising if you reflect on the fact that project management is about producing results. And people who carry out projects are very often obsessed with getting things done. So 80% of these 135 people said, my job is to get the job done. About half of that 80% added a caveat. Okay, they added a few more words. They said, my job is to get the job done on time, within budget, according to specifications. So those three things, on time, within budget, according to specifications, were tagged on to the initial statement, my job is to get the job done. We've heard this answer so frequently for so many years that we've given those three things a name. They're given a name. We call them the triple constraints. All projects everywhere in the history of the world have operated under the three constraints of time, budget, and specification. Now let's look at each of those constraints just briefly here. Time. We've already seen in the definition of projects that projects occur in a block of time. We have deadline dates. So we are already aware of the time constraint on our projects. To deal with the time constraint, we have to get good at scheduling our projects. A large part of the project effort, managing the project, entails putting together schedules using famous tools like Gantt charts and PERT charts and milestone charts. So getting the job done on time. Within budget. Now, some of you may say, well, I can't deal with that because I don't have a budget. And in fact, if you don't have a budget on your project, you're in the majority. By budget, I mean a monetary budget. If you don't have a monetary budget, let's say a $1.3 million budget for your project that you are aware of, that you can work with, you are in the majority. I did another survey a few years ago of just under 200 project managers, and something like 70% of the people in my survey indicated that they did not have a usable budget to guide them in carrying out their project efforts. And there are various reasons why they didn't have a usable budget. They may have, say, a dollar budget, but the data they have, the budget data, can't be used to actually track tasks. It's geared towards the accounting system, it's not geared towards the projects. That's one thing. In other cases, some of these people didn't have a budget because the senior management of their organizations viewed budgets as strategic information that they didn't want competitors to know. Other organizations didn't have budgets because they were just disorganized and never bothered putting together a budget. So there are various explanations of why the people in my survey didn't have budgets to work with. The key point here I'm trying to make, however, is that 70% of these people didn't have budget data to guide them in doing their project effort. So you might say, well, let's throw that constraint out, getting the job done on time within specs, that I understand, but if we don't have a budget, we can't really deal with it. And actually, if you're thinking that, you're not entirely correct. The Defense Department, back in the 1950s and 60s, recognized that many people don't have dollar budgets for whatever reason. And what they did was they said, well, forget about dollar budgets. If you don't have a dollar budget, then you can't work with it. Look instead at something called level of effort budgets. For example, if I have 5 people working 3 days, okay, 5 times 3, during those 3 days, those 5 people are doing 15 person days of effort. That's a form of budget, if you think about it. Okay, if I have 2 people working 12 days. 2 times 12, that's 24 person days of effort. Again, that's budget. In fact, if you know the the daily wages that these people make, let's say they make $100 a day, okay, and they're working 24 person days of effort on this project, that's $2,400 of their effort is going into this project. Clearly there are other things you want to take into account. You want to take into account overhead costs, cost of electricity, these kinds of things. But my point here is, even if you don't have monetary budgets to deal with, in project management we don't let you use that as an excuse not to carry out budget efforts. You do have level of effort budgeting, and plenty of effective project managers and project teams use level of effort budgets when they don't have the monetary budgets to work with. Okay, so getting the job done on time, within budget. The third constraint, specifications, deals with the technical aspects of the project. Projects are carried out to produce deliverables that do certain things. And the certain things that the deliverables do, we try to capture that with the specifications. So these 3 constraints taken together affect all of us when we do our project work. Now, the emphasis on which constraint is the most important changes over time. Back in the late 1980s and the 1990s, the industrialized countries of the world were obsessed with something called total quality management. The Japanese had created a wonderful model for the other industrialized countries where quality levels of Japanese production became very, very high. And the other Western countries found that they were losing their competitive position, so they began trying to improve the quality of their goods and services. Okay, so with the quality management movement, the specifications become very important. Back in the old days, we used to define quality as conformance to specifications. So I would say, based even on my own experience in doing projects a long time, that back in the late 1980s, early 1990s, when quality was such an important issue, that of the 3 constraints, people tended to focus especially on, well, let's make sure we get a good product. Let's make sure we get the specs right. And then deliver a really good product, even if it causes schedule delays and cost overruns. As time went on, by the mid-1990s and towards the end of the 1990s, I think the competitive pressure made the time constraint the most significant constraint. I call time at that, today in fact, I call time the killer constraint. Because many of the people I work with who do project work have come to realize that the single greatest competitive advantage an organization has over other organizations in today's world is speed. Getting things produced very quickly. Responding to customer inquiries or customer complaints quickly. So speed gives you a competitive edge. And I've heard plenty of people in the project environment saying something like the following. You know, if I deliver a project a little bit over cost, I can live with that. Okay, if I need to negotiate a change of scope, okay, a change in the specifications and deliver a little bit less, generally I find that I can do that. The one thing I cannot negotiate with my customers is the deadline date. I hear that over and over again. We can't negotiate the deadline date. If we promise to do something by March 15th, we really need to deliver it by March 15th. So in today's world, we can perhaps have a bit of a cost overrun and perhaps change the specs a little bit, but our customers aren't allowing us to slip the schedule. Now, I predict that even this will change. My sense, looking around the world today, is that we're promising to do things so fast that it's becoming impossible to achieve our schedule goals these days unless we have more resources. So I think what we're going to do is see in the next wave more emphasis on let's give us some more resources to enable us to produce those high quality products and to produce them as fast as possible. So this is natural. The issue is not which of the three specs is universally the most important spec. The real issue is, given today's world, which of the three specs is the killer constraint. Okay, the importance of the different constraints changes over time. That's a basic point. Let's just go back and summarize then what we've covered here, because in this little block of time I have been speaking right now, I've been trying to identify what is a project and what is project management. So projects are efforts that occur in a finite block of time. They produce deliverables. They are unique and always have some measure of uncertainty and risk associated with them. And then when you analyze them carefully, you see they are systems. They tend to be inherently complex. Okay, what is project management? Project management, I'm going to use the common sense definition. Project management is about getting the job done. Getting it done on time, within budget, and according to specifications. Let's take a look at one of the ugly realities that we encounter in project management. And that ugly reality is that the dominant law of project management is something called Murphy's Law. Murphy's Law is stated in various ways. The most common statement is the following: if something can go wrong, it will go wrong. Okay, now think about that. That's pretty depressing if you reflect on it. And that is that the governing law affecting us in our project operations is a statement that says things are going to go wrong. If something can go wrong, it will go wrong. Now, one of the things I want to point out in my course is that Murphy's Law is to a large extent hardwired into the way we do projects. Think about the definition of projects, about getting the job done on time, within budget, according to specifications. If you think about those things, on time, budget, specifications, sometimes we call those three things the trade-off triangle, because there's always tension between these three things. It's always tension. You have to get something done faster. Your customer complains that you're going too slow. The only way to get things done faster might be to increase resource utilization, so that puts pressure on your budget. If you do things faster, then there's a danger that you'll be having negative impacts on quality. Your quality goes down. That affects the specifications. So if you think about it then, just the very way that projects are, we define projects, getting the job done on time, within budget, according to specifications, shows that we have an inherent tension between the time, the resources, and then the actual physical specifications that define the deliverable itself. Okay, but there's more to it, to Murphy's Law on our projects than just that inherent conflict between the three constraints. Now, before I go into more detailed description of the inevitability of problems on projects, I'd like to just give some statistics confirming, backing up my view that projects are indeed problem-filled. Back in 1995, people who worked in the information technology arena were shocked by a study carried out by a consulting organization called the Standish Group. They produced a study back in 1995 where they looked at more than 8,000 information technology projects whose total dollar value was greater than $25 billion. That's a lot of big projects. Okay, they examined this large group of projects that were consuming substantial resources, and they found that only 16% were clear-cut successes. That means 84% of those 8,000 plus projects were something less than clear-cut successes, meaning they experienced some measure of struggle, of failure, if you will. Now, of that 84%, something like 34% were total losses. Okay, so basically what we're saying here is a third of the projects being examined by the Standish Group were just total losses. Of that 84% that didn't experience complete success, 50% were in what the Standish Group called in recovery. That means people recognized they were in trouble, and steps were being taken to fix the problems to the extent possible. So that Standish Group study caused a lot of us, including me, to start wondering, geez, is this particular finding an anomaly, or are we finding that project failure is very pervasive, far more pervasive than we traditionally thought? So I began doing my own research on project success and failure, and about the outset of 1998, I had a chance to work with 437 project professionals, and I surveyed them. And I asked them about their success and failure experiences on their last project. So one of the questions I asked them was, on your last project, did you encounter some measure of cost overruns, or did you do the project right within budget, or did you actually save money? And 55% of the 437 people in my study reported that they had some degree of cost overrun. So 45% either did the job within the budget or they came in under budget. I asked them, on your last project, how did you do in dealing with the specifications? Did you meet the specs? Did you do better than what you were supposed to be doing? Or did you have some struggle in achieving the specifications and doing all the things you were supposed to do? And here the results were much happier than the cost results. 69% of the respondents indicated that they either met the specifications or did better than meeting the specifications. So they outperformed what they were supposed to do even. So we see that there wasn't a major problem. Still 31% struggled with the specs, but for the most part there wasn't a major problem there with the specifications. Now let's turn to time, the killer constraint. In the survey, I asked, on your last project, how did you do in respect to achieving your schedule? Did you meet the schedule? Did you have schedule delays? Did you come in ahead of schedule? And more than 2/3 of the respondents indicated that they had schedule delays. Half, about a third, said they had serious schedule delays, and then another third of the total sample said that they had modest schedule delays. But over 2/3 of the respondents indicated that they encountered some degree of schedule delays on their project. If you took all the data for these 437 people, put it all together, I reported the data as three separate items, but if you put all the data together, you'd find that over 80% of my respondents in my survey indicated that they had some measure of failure on their projects, very closely replicating the findings of the Standish Group study. Now in my study, I wasn't only looking at information technology people. I had people in construction, I had people in retailing, I had people in pharmaceuticals, I had people in information technology, telecommunications. So it was a much more mixed group than what the Standish group looked at. But nonetheless, I was getting the same types of results the Standish group researchers were getting, indicating that a substantial portion of projects that are being carried out result in some degree of failure. Now, we're not saying that there were total losses. That's not the point that we're making here. We are saying about a third, okay, of the projects appear to be total losses in the number of studies that have been carried out, but still, of the remaining projects, some of the problems are minor problems, a 2-week scheduled slippage perhaps, or a 5% cost overrun, and they're not serious, but they weren't perfect projects. That's the point. So the more we examine the experiences people are having on projects, the more we see that encountering struggles, encountering slippages, cost overruns, inability to meet the specs is really quite common. Most projects actually encounter those kinds of struggles. Now I want to go back just for one moment and take a look at the business, the result I had that indicated that a large portion of projects, 69%, were able to achieve the specifications. Think about that. There's some important implications in that finding. What that finding is telling us is that if you give me enough money, okay, if you give me enough time, I can ultimately achieve the specifications. So in the final analysis, achieving the specifications is no big deal given infinite budgets and infinite time. So in my study with my 437 respondents, what appears to have been happening was ultimately the people were able to produce a deliverable, and ultimately the deliverable was able to satisfy the specifications. But in order to produce that deliverable, most of these folks encountered cost overruns and schedule slippages. Now, let's take a look at the inevitability of struggles on our projects and see how they are hardwired into the project management process. Back in the 1980s, I was doing research that indicated that about 70% of the struggles that people report having on their projects are tied to 3 predictable sources of problems. And I wrote a whole book that based on this particular premise. It was called Managing Projects in Organization. So what we find then is there are 3 universal sources of problems that are predictable, that appear to be inherent in our projects, inherent in the processes we implement to carry out our projects. One predictable source of problems is the organization in which we work. Okay, I don't encounter many people who will argue with me on that. I have people who work on projects constantly saying to me, geez, if I only had more support, or if I had only worked with a different organization, I think I could do a lot better job achieving the goals that have been laid out for me. So predictable organizational sources of problems. Now, within organizational sources of problems, one set of problems is especially outstanding, and those are problems associated with managing using borrowed resources. Now, I don't know if you are aware of this, if you've thought about this, but something like 90% of projects carried out in the United States use borrowed resources. The people who are doing the project work, the team members, are borrowed. For example, we may borrow somebody from the testing shop to come in and test our product as it's emerging from time to time at different milestone points. We'll have code writers coming in writing software code. When we're done with them, we send them back to the coding shop. We'll have design people designing some of our solutions. When they're done, they go back to the design shop. The point is, these people are basically loaned out to the project. They're there temporarily. Okay, now the fact that you have borrowed resources working on your project leads to some pretty predictable consequences. For example, one thing you can count on is that a lot of the people, the borrowed resources themselves, aren't particularly happy operating in such an environment. They complain that they have other things to do. They have their performance objectives to achieve that are part of their, let's say, their annual job plan, their work performance plan. They complain that when they are brought on to a new project, they're spending about a third of their time trying to get up to speed technically on what do I need to do the project work, also up to speed organizationally, getting to know who the other team members are, and what's important, who isn't, what isn't important, these kind of social issues. So the borrowed resources themselves come to the project very often with a negative attitude. Other complaints they have is they're only seeing a piece of the project. They rarely get to see the whole thing. One person says, well, I saw an ear. Somebody else says, well, I saw a trunk. Somebody else says, oh, I saw a foot. Okay, so remember the old story of three people trying to define what an elephant looks like. And they're all seeing pieces of the elephant, and very few of them ever get to see the whole elephant. A major concern that the borrowed resources have is, on this project effort, how will I be evaluated? The project manager typically isn't qualified to evaluate me technically. They don't know my technical skills. My boss, my real boss, who's my functional manager back home, doesn't have any idea of what I'm doing day by day. How can he or she evaluate me? So again, you have an environment here with these borrowed resources where when they come to a project, don't be surprised if they're nervous. Don't be surprised if their number one goal is to get back to their real work as fast as possible. Okay? The project manager has a lot of complaints in this environment that are predictable as well. For example, one complaint is, how do I get the right number of the right people at the right time? So a major struggle that project manager has on all projects is acquiring resources. Not just acquiring them, but acquiring the right people, okay, in the right quantity at the right time. And sometimes we tend to forget that getting the people at the right time is as important as getting qualified people in the right number. For example, if you send me Albert Einstein a week too early, I can't use Dr. Einstein on my project. If Dr. Einstein winds up coming to my project a week too late, I wasn't able to use him. So I need Einstein when I need Einstein. So I need the qualified people coming in the right quantity at the right time. Now, even if I'm fortunate enough to assemble the right people in the right number at the right time, I still got struggles as a project manager. And that is, I realize that I don't control these people. I am not their boss. Their real boss is their functional manager, who fills out their performance appraisal review each year, who helps give them their annual growth plans, works with them on trying to figure out what they should be striving, what their objectives should be this year, and how to grow on the job, these kinds of things. I'm a project manager. I'm their temporary boss, as it were. So how do I motivate these people who are borrowed resources? Even functional managers have many complaints that are associated with matrix management. The functional managers, for example, are nervous. What's happening to my people when they leave my shop? Are they practicing good practice? Are they doing what they're supposed to be doing? Are they doing good quality work? Functional managers complain that when people ask them for resources, they always ask for the best resources. In 35 years of doing project work, I've never heard the following request. Do you have any dead wood available next week? Okay, everybody wants the good resources. Nobody wants the dead wood. The functional managers are concerned that by lending out these resources, they're not able to achieve their particular goals within their operations as well. So here you have organizational sources of problems that are totally predictable, just linked to this one feature that is a dominant feature of project management work, at least in the United States, and that is that projects are staffed with borrowed people. Okay, another predictable source of problems is poor management of needs and requirements, and we'll be covering this later in this program. Okay, but one thing that we always struggle with is defining needs. Even something so basic as identifying who are our customers is often not very easy to achieve. One thing that we learned in the 1990s during the total quality management movement is that we must identify customers more broadly. My boss is my customer to a certain extent. If I don't satisfy my boss's needs and wants, I'm not going to have an easy time achieving my project objectives. We have external customers, the powerful person who signs a check, releasing funds to us to achieve our project work, that customer. You have actual physical users, people who are going to use our solutions that we provide them. And notice, even amongst the users, they have multiple points of view on what the project deliverable should be doing. So when you start looking at this, we have multiple customers. Each of these customers have contending needs and wants. Part of our job in carrying out projects and defining needs and requirements is to sort through the contending needs and wants and to try to come up with some kind of a solution that satisfies the largest number of the people, of the people who are the most significant customers. So this is, again, a predictable issue, just even trying to determine who are our customers. Other problems in defining and managing needs is physically trying to contend with the fact that needs are dynamic. Needs change from second to second. They change for various reasons. They change because technology is changing. They change because people change their minds. They change because the business environment's changing. You know, as we're sitting there planning our projects and having these great ideas that we're going to pursue, our competitors aren't sitting still. They're trying to come out with products that put us out of business. So they're changing the rules of the game constantly. So there are many sources of change that we encounter that force needs to become very unstable. I think perhaps the most significant source of changing needs and wants in the last 10 years or so has been the changing players. If you recall, in the 1990s we began implementing something called business process reengineering. Business process reengineering had everybody in government, in private companies, in nonprofit organizations assessing their business processes, the way they do their business, and then constantly reorganizing their business efforts. And this led to continual change in who's doing what work, who the bosses are, who the workers are, these kinds of things. And so I had, a few years ago, I'd ask my students when I would do public seminars, I'd say, how many of you had a change in your job description in the last year? And always I'd have about 70–75% raising their hand saying, me. I had some people saying, oh, I had 5 changes in my job description the past year. Then I'd say, how many of you have had a change in supervisor, boss, whatever you want, coach, whatever you want to call this person, in the last year? And again, you'd have 70–75% of the people raising their hands saying, I had a change in a significant coach, boss, whatever, last year. And then I'd ask an important question that people didn't think much about. But when I ask this question, you're going to see its importance. And I said, how many people in the audience here had a change in customer in the last year? Okay, and the customers, okay, so again, 70–75%, we find that customers are changing. And the really high impact question is, how many of you had customers whose bosses changed in the last year? And once again, more than half of the respondents indicated that their bosses changed this past, the customers' bosses changed in the past year. Now think about that. You might say, well, who cares about the customer's boss? If the customer's boss changes, That means that you may find yourself on the project you're working with suddenly facing a whole new set of priorities. Every time someone powerful comes on board, they may feel compelled to say, well, my predecessor was doing a pretty good job, but my requirements are a bit different, and so on and so forth. So let me reiterate now. One predictable source of problems is organizational, and we use matrix management to explain how there are predictable issues of organizations that we need to contend with. Another set of problems is poor management, of needs and requirements. And we saw that needs are very dynamic. Requirements are just the physical embodiment of needs. Okay, requirements we try to capture those needs and then state them in order to be able to design solutions. And where requirements go bad, there are really two areas where requirements go bad. Is one, did we capture them properly? Do these requirements truly reflect customer needs and wants? Okay, that's the requirements capture issue. And then later on, once a project is underway, our major problem, predictable, is dealing with changes to requirements. I'm telling you, absolutely positively, whatever requirements you establish at the outset of a project, they're going to change. That's predictable. So managing the change to the requirements becomes a second major issue of requirements management that people have to be sensitive to. A third broad area of predictable problems on projects is poor planning and control. And I think everybody in the audience already recognizes that. If I were to ask you, okay, what do you think is a predictable source of problems in managing projects, I would bet that the great majority of you would say right away, poor planning and control. The point here is if your project isn't properly planned, you will have problems. It's foreordained. Okay, it's guaranteed. If once the project is underway, you don't have good control processes in place, the project's going to go out of control. You will have guaranteed problems. So what I'm telling you now is that, yep, Murphy's Law is inevitable. That's the bad news. The good news is that we know where most of the problems are going to arise. We know that about 70% of the struggles you have will be tied to organizational factors. They'll be tied to difficulties in trying to manage needs and requirements. And they'll be tied to struggles in doing effective planning and control. Of the three areas I just mentioned, the easiest one to deal with is the planning and control. If people develop basic, say, scheduling processes and budgeting processes, if you educate and train the workforce to do effective scheduling and budgeting and resource allocation, the planning and control issues can be handled fairly readily. It's much more difficult dealing with organizational issues where things like politics creep in, things like personalities and personality conflicts, those kinds of things arise. Those are much harder to deal with. Needs and requirements, managing them effectively, that probably lies between planning and control as being the easiest issues to deal with, and organizational factors as being the most difficult, because we're developing mechanisms for effectively capturing needs and requirements and implementing them and change control, and we're getting better and better at it, but still it's a bit of a struggle. So what we've done here in this first portion of our project management overview program is to look at some very basic issues that establish the project management environment. We've seen, for example, what projects are. Okay, projects are about producing results in a defined period of time. They are unique. They are systems. They have inherent complexity built into them. And we saw how arising from the very definition of projects, there are various management issues. For example, the fact that projects are unique guarantees that we're going to encounter risk, and we have to be pretty good at managing risk on the project. We also looked at the inevitability of Murphy's Law, and saw that things constantly do go wrong on our projects. We have data, we have evidence by talking to people who've done projects to determine that the great majority of projects don't get the job done exactly on time within budget according to specs, that a substantial portion of them have to struggle to achieve the triple constraints. So we've seen that, and we even saw that there are predictable sources of problems, and part of our job in project management is to focus on organizational sources of problems that are predictable, focusing on the predictable issues of defining needs and requirements and managing them effectively, and dealing with the predictable consequence of not having good plans or good control processes in place. So what we're going to need to do in the future is to take a look more positively. What can we do to manage our projects, to deal with Murphy's Law, to deal with these inherent struggles that all of us, when we carry out little projects, middle-sized projects, big projects, have to contend with.